I've played a lot of games, but for the most part, what I play has been dictated by the viewership on Twitch. I carry a significant backlog of my own creation, and we slowly go through it every single day. I know it might seem tedious and stupid for me to allow that level of decision to go to other people, but I do have borderline personality disorder, so having the choices of what I play relegated to a community makes it so much easier for me to plan what I do every single day. Now, Shawn Bennett 4574 requested this in a firefighter giveaway episode, but his video wasn't selected. However, I was already planning to keep this particular series going because I do have tons of games I want to play. So thank you, Shawn, for keeping that interest going for me. I do appreciate it. Today I'm going to talk about 10 more games I haven't played, but want to. Let's begin. I love point and clicks, and the one thing that I always enjoyed about point and clicks is how each company has their own standard on how they want the player to interface with the game. LucasArts, Sierra, Revolution, Cyan, there were so many different ways, and if you show me a snippet of a point and click, I can usually guess with almost 75% accuracy what company's engine is being used. That being said, Access Software had their own unique style for Tex Murphy. The first game had a text parser, the second had a more LucasArts style, and I loved both of those games. They were innovative in an era that was saturated with other point and clicks. Now the next game for me is Tex Murphy Under a Killing Moon, and it's the first in the franchise to have 3D renderings of the environment Tex exists in. And of course it's from the FMV era, so I'm excited to see what Access Studio manages to pull out. I do know that the game was incredibly successful and highly praised, and given the track record for the franchise, I'm sure I'll love it. I've made a very conscious effort to work through Castlevania in order of release to avoid this specific game, because as I've stated so many times before, I am not a fan of Metroidvanias. But I do feel if there was ever a game that might change my perspective on it, it would be this one. So now I'm pulling back the blinders and I'm opening my horizons to giving this game a chance, but in order to get there, I do have quite a few games to go. I want to beat the Japanese version of Dracula's Curse, Castlevania 2 Belmont's Revenge, Kid Dracula, Castlevania Chronicles, Bloodlines, Rondo of Blood, and Dracula X before I take on Symphony of the Night. It's just one of those instances where rules of release are preventing me from really hitting it hard, and I know at some point I will, and when I play this, you will all be the first to know. I've covered Breath of Fire a few times in my episodes because to me it's very much baby's first JRPG. The only game off the top of my head that I feel is easier is Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, which is kind of a throwaway, but good for folks who don't want to invest as much time into grinding or really anything that makes a JRPG a JRPG. Breath of Fire 1 and 2, they were okay, kind of mid, but good enough to stand out on the Super Nintendo. But Breath of Fire 3, brother, that's an entire ass game. Some of the greatest JRPGs thrived on the PlayStation 1, and it was the one platform we could count on for a majority of RPGs being solid. In some ways, it was the golden era, and because it was the golden era, we got not only one, but two Breath of Fire entries on the PS1. I loved Breath of Fire 3, I liked the characters, the combat, the music. Sure, it had gnarly load times, but that's okay, I'm alright with that. Because I loved Breath of Fire 3 so much, I look forward to Breath of Fire 4, because I know it's the last good one. The series went severely downhill after 4, so much so that I doubt we will ever see another Breath of Fire game. Dragon Quarter and 6 were just abhorrent mistakes of video game programming. In a previous episode that I made talking about 10 games that I want to play, I mentioned that for a long time I've wanted to check out the third Fatal Fury game that was on the Neo Geo CD, because it's the only game I own for the system. But Fatal Fury kept going on way past Fatal Fury 3. In fact, in the main line alone, there were 5 more games. The one that I really look forward to playing is Real Bout Fatal Fury, because it has a power gauge which allows us to whip out super moves. In previous games, we could just do powerful moves at will, but they weren't fancy like we would see in Street Fighter. We also have the ability to ring out, aerial combos, and more. In some ways, this particular game is where Fatal Fury finally implemented standards that had been around for quite some time. Many folks consider this a masterpiece, and believe it or not, I actually own the MVS card for it. So fingers crossed I'll play it at some point. Six DOF, a genre that is criminally underutilized, because for many people, it induces motion sickness. But that's what 6 DOF is, 6 degrees of freedom. Up and down, forward and backward, left and right. And for the most part, the only game I played that fit the bill was Forsaken 64, but that game is an obnoxious piece of dog shit from Acclaim. So instead, I played the Forsaken remaster on PC, and that game was phenomenal. But the one game people always say did 6 DOF well is Descent, a first-person shooter mixed with a shoot-'em-up that stands as one of the most successful games in the subgenre. It was Parallax Software's first game, and they kept that franchise running for a little bit. Now, for anyone who doesn't know who Parallax Software is, you might actually know them. If not for Descent, then for Saints Row. Yeah, same company. In 1996, Mike Kulas and Matt Toshlag broke up the company and went their separate ways. Toshlag created Outrage Entertainment, which made 2 games, Descent 3 and Alter Echo, while Kulas created, ready for it, Volition, the far more successful company that brought us Red Faction, Saints Row, and that weird game Agents of Mayhem. Descent has quite a few different games. The main line had 3, and then there was a Splinter franchise with Free Space, which had 2 games on its own, and I do look forward to checking them all out as time goes on. If it's anything like Forsaken, then I'm sure I'm going to have a blast with them. I talk a lot about how some of my best memories of gaming were created in an arcade. There were tons of games for me to choose. Most of the time, if I was lucky, I had $3 to $5 that I could spend. For those who are a little bit older than me, you might recall games having a quarter a credit, which is how it should be. But for my generation, the arcade was fading out, and arcade owners would go above and beyond to bump up the credits required to play a game. So in some ways, I had to budget my own token economy. Classic games were 1 credit, fighting games tended to be 2 credits, basic light gun games were 2 credits, then you had the premium games like DDR, light gun games with cockpits, and more importantly, Silent Scope. Silent Scope was one of my favorite arcade games to check out because how it's designed, at least from a controller perspective, was so intuitive to me. Nothing else was like that. Most light guns of the era were either glorified paperweights, or in the case of Time Crisis and Crisis Zone, they either vibrated or they just kicked back. So seeing a secondary screen through the scope, that was really cool to me. I do own all 3 in the trilogy, but I don't know if they're as fun as the arcade version is. We'll see. I've played the original FZero and I've played FZero GX, but I've never played FZero X. I never rented it, I own it, but I've never played it. And the only reason I know about this game, at least historically, was because Captain Falcon was in Super Smash Bros. I remember being a kid and thinking, who's this goon? Turns out he pilots the Blue Falcon, so to put that into perspective, he's like Dale Earnhardt getting out of his car and joining an underground fighting ring. And that brought me eternal joy. F-Zero is oftentimes considered one of the best arcade racing franchises that would grace the home console market, but I personally paid more attention to Mario Kart 64 as well as Extreme G1 and 2, that's just what I owned. And you know what's funny? Ari has played F-Zero X because she wanted to play a racing game, and I just sat back and watched. She bounced around about 500 times and blew up and said, "Wow, this is tough," before turning it off and popping in Ocarina of Time. Atta girl. I've avoided the mid-era Sonic games like the plague because Sonic Team has been doing nose beers for such a long time that I'm disillusioned to the idea of any 3D Sonic game being remotely sufferable to the general population of this floating chunk of rock known as the Earth! Somewhere around the mid-2000s, probably Sonic 06, Team Sonic started aligning with the fundamental theory of not giving a fuck, and their products have not been appealing to me in the slightest. In fact, the only Sonic game that really stood out to me was Sonic Mania. But I do have a lot of games to go, including Sonic Adventures, but I own the DX version, which is a kind of enhanced version from the native Dreamcast entry. When I say enhanced, think of the difference between Resident Evil Code Veronica and Code Veronica X. Most of the changes are aesthetic in nature, the bonus being this Chow racing game that ties into the Game Boy Advance, and the ability to unlock all 12 Sonic games for the Game Gear. Did you know that there were that many? If you want to learn about Sonic, I've done a Ready Go Gaming show covering every single Sonic game out there. I'll put it down in the description below and at the end of this video. This is a Hallmark Dreamcast game, and even before it was a Dreamcast game, it was a highly successful arcade cabinet created by Sega AM3, or Hitmaker if you care about Sega's history. Speaking of Sega's history, again, I did make a Ready Go Gaming show all about the history of Sega, so if you want to check that out, yet again, I'll put it down in the description and at the end of this video. But Hitmaker, they were a solid company, one of the more profitable in-house development studios for Sega. They made Virtual On, Sega Rally, Virtua Tennis, Derby's Owner Club, The Key of Avalon, but to me, the most culturally relevant one was Crazy Taxi. Now, I spent a lot of time in the arcades growing up, but I cannot for the life of me remember ever seeing a Crazy Taxi arcade cabinet. I've seen so many people play it, and I've never popped it into my Dreamcast. I'm even aware of the lawsuit between Sega and Fox over Simpsons Road Rage. As an arcade game, Crazy Taxi places us in a car, and our only job is to pick up customers and get them there as fast as possible. Period. Because your fare depends on it. I know that on the Dreamcast version we can play a few different modes, all of which are based on time limits, or you can just play the original arcade version. Your choice. This is a callback to a much simpler time in my life. When I still had my Wii, Blockbuster was still kind of existing. It was during that weird transitionary time where you knew that Blockbuster was about to go under, as Netflix and, believe it or not, Redbox were slowly increasing their market presence. So in the last few summers of my childhood where Blockbuster was relevant, I was renting Wii games. And the one game that I remember playing but never beating was Red Steel. I will say, this is not a good game. It's really gimmicky, and to be honest, the controls that the Wii had didn't really translate well to the programming skills of Ubisoft Paris, but I didn't care. I was a kid, and I was slashing people with a sword while also shooting them with guns. It was the unique blend of Japanese swordsmanship and American gunslinging, and I ate that up as a kid. I loved it. Now, the story is simple. We play as some weeb named Scott Monroe who manages to snag himself up a hot Asian chick named Miyu. But before we can officially meet the dad, shit goes horribly wrong, and a gang comes in and starts shooting up the hotel room that we meet the dad in. To me, it was my first encounter with the Yakuza, and it interested me. And who knows, maybe it would interest you. Just be prepared for the controls to go dogshit occasionally. It's just something that happens in this game. And that's it for today's episode. Are there any games that you really want to play but haven't? Feel free to tell everyone in the comments section below. Who knows, maybe you'll share a common denominator with someone in the community. Speaking of our community, if you made it to the end of this episode, you're already home in our community. We're a gathering of like-minded individuals who love remembering a time when life was just easier to live, and if you align with that, you'll fit right in. Finally, the single most important thing you can do for me is to hit that thumbs up button, as it directly impacts the visibility of the projects and the videos that I work on every single day. As always, from my family to your family, good energy, good vibes. Fortefyre out.